So we will get that set up. She's back on now, and that will be happening in just a minute here. Thanks for your patience. Okay, everyone, thanks for bearing with us. So it is 6:06 p.m. and this is a public meeting of the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing Settlement and Policy Subcommittee meeting. Next slide, please. Oop. All right.
There we go.
And let's move over to introductions and get started with introductions from our PCCEP members. Pastor Weisner, would you get us started and pass it along?
Yes, thank you very much. I am the chair of the Settlement Policy, also co-chair of the full committee along with Celeste. And I look like I will pass it over to Leslie.
Good evening, everyone. Leslie Martinez, PCCEP member of the Community Engagement Subcommittee as well as the Policy Subcommittee. Nice to be here with everyone. I will pass it over to Byron.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Byron Vaughn, PCCEP member, and also a member of the Settlement and Policy Subcommittee. I'm glad everybody's here tonight. Thank you. I'll pass it to Nathan. He's the first one I see.
Thanks, Byron. Good evening, everyone. Nathan Castle, he, him pronouns, member of the subcommittee and member of PCCEP. And I will pass it to, let's see, now I have to look at my list. Who's next?
I see Kip and Odelia.
Oh, Kip.
Well, that makes it easier for me. I'm Kip Silverman, PCCEP member, he, him pronoun. I'll pass it to Odelia.
Hi everyone, good morning, evening. My name's Odelia and I use she, her pronouns.
And I also saw Carrie.
Yes, hi, I'm Carrie Driver and I'm a new PCCEP member. I don't see anyone to pass it to. Please.
Yeah, I think that's everyone. PCCEP, if I missed anybody, please jump in, but I think we got you all. Okay. At this time, I'll invite any city staff, PPB attendees, DOJ, to introduce themselves, and I'll start. I'm Dory Grabinski, PCCEP project manager.
Hi, everybody. Stephanie Howard here, Mayor's Director of Community Safety.
Hey, everybody. Chuck Lavelle, Assistant Chief, Portland Police Bureau.
Hello, Ken Dulio, Lieutenant with the FIT team, ECST, and the Crisis Response Team.
Hi, I am Lauren Brown, Police Bureau. I'm the Manager of Strategic Services Division.
Hi, my name is Aubrey Perry. I'm a crime data analyst in the Strategic Services Division.
Good evening. I'm Officer Natasha Hansberg at Portland Police Bureau. I work with Chief Lavelle, Community Engagement. Thank you for having me.
All right, I'll jump in then. My name is Afrida Davis, and I am a facilitator for tonight's meeting.
Excellent. And next slide. Odelia, would you mind reading our community agreements?
Yes. Listen actively and respectfully, share airtime, be present and open to new information and perspectives, assume positive intent, respect each other, respect the group, speak your own truth, communicate directly, honestly, and respectfully, ask questions to clarify, call out bias, and be okay with ambiguity.
Thank you. All right. So an overview of today's meeting, pretty straightforward. We have several members from PPB here, in particular the Strategic Services Division, to present the STOPS data report. So we're going to start off digging into that. They're going to present the report to us. We'll take a quick break, and then the second half of the meeting will largely be focused on Q&A about the report. And then we will have an open public comment period as always. All right, and I think we're just going to jump right in. So I do want to reintroduce, we heard from them in the introductions, but on the next slide, we have our PPB presenters. So we are joined by Aubrey Perry, Lauren Brown, Chuck Lavelle, and Ken Dulio tonight, and I will hand it over to them. Oh, and let me know who needs the ability to share screen if needed.
That'll be me, Aubrey. He needs this ability to share.
Great, I'll give that to you right now. Actually, whoever the main host of the meeting is, please give Aubrey Perry co-host permissions.
I have it now, so
Great.
it should be up on your screen. Let me know if you guys see it.
Yes.
Perfect. So hi, my name is Aubrey Perry. I'm a crime data analyst here in the Strategic Services Division. We are here talking about one of, honestly, my favorite topics, the STOPS annual report. Who are the Strategic Services Division? Let's start there. We are an entirely professional staff. There are 3 managers. Lauren Brown, who's also here tonight, is the manager of SSD, the overall manager. And there are 15 analysts like myself. I'm a crime data analyst, and some other analysts in the division just mainly focus on investigative work with the detectives and other specialty units. So here's a very, very brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to essentially cover the STOPS report in very brief form from cover to cover. We're going to try to cover everything from STOPS to the racial and ethnic demographics of the STOPS, to stop reasons, searches, search findings, stop disposition. We're also going to talk about fit stops, which is, I'm so glad Lieutenant Dulio is here because he can talk about those way better than I can. So before we dig into the report, I just want to give a brief overview of what we do with STOPS analysis. And so our goal is to use research-supported best practices from academic institutions, law enforcement agencies, community oversight groups, anyone in the field that knows a lot about STOPS. And because there's so many different groups, so many different people involved, methodologies and conclusions vary, and that's expected. And that's a great thing about the wealth of the scientific community here. We mainly, when we talk about the report, which you'll see throughout tonight's presentation, is we separate into 2 broad organizational divisions, traffic and non-traffic. Just from experience and just what we've seen in the data, these 2 groups stop people for different reasons due to the variation in their operational goals. I'll come back to a little bit later. But the key takeaway about that is because these large groups are doing different things with different missions, we need different benchmarks to describe activity. So what is a benchmark? And this slide is called the benchmarking problem, because that's what a few leading academic researchers have called it. So a benchmark is essentially the underlying population you want to compare something against. So, like if you're taking bananas from a grocery store, an individual banana might be your research project, and all the bananas in the grocery store might be your benchmark population. We are trying to determine what is the perfect population to compare STOPS to. So the benchmarking problem is trying to best understand the population of people, of those that can be reasonably stopped by police. Because of that, there's lots of different groups of people. There's driving population and non-driving population. There's geographic distribution of populations. Not all parts of Portland have the same racial and ethnic demographics. And it does vary even by the street level, by the neighborhood level, by the precinct level. for us to look at. It can also vary by time of day, day of week. People that driving to or from a typical 9 to 5 job Monday through Friday may look different than people driving to work on a swing shift or something, or people that are driving on the weekends for nightlife or entertainment. And then, of course, the other thing is there's also behaviors that may attract different types of police attention. Speeders versus non-speeders, people that don't have a license plate versus those that do have a license plate. These are all complicating factors, we might say, that makes it hard to best understand what is the underlying population. In a perfect world, we would have a benchmark that addresses all the concerns and perfectly describes the population that might be stopped by police. Sadly, perfection does not exist, so we kind of have to use what is best out there. So one of the most common things that you may go, hey, but wait a second, Aubrey, we've got the census that the Census Bureau puts out every 10 years. And you're right, they do. It's the easiest to attain, but it doesn't account for really any of the variables outlined. It is only looking at the residential population, doesn't really look at drivers versus non-drivers. You can zoom down into a little bit more narrow analysis, but it is still kind of blocky and still kind of doesn't really cover some micro locations, you might say. And it can be highly variable from year to year if you use some of the supporting stuff like the American Community Survey or the Current Population Survey. And variable from year to year makes it really hard to understand, oh, what's the actual racial, ethnic, and demographics of the city of Portland? And some have even said, researchers, that the census is so flawed that it can provide such an inaccurate look at the people that might be stopped by law enforcement agencies that no benchmark at all might be a better use than putting the census out there because it is so highly flawed. One of the gold standards out there is observational data. This comes out of Washington, D.C. about 18 years ago at this point, which took a team of researchers and put them at different corners around the city. And they had a notebook and they literally just said, oh, there's a car. I perceive the driver of that car to be white. I perceive the driver of that car to be Hispanic or Latino. And they did that for hours upon hours a day at strategic locations around the city. That helped them get a very accurate picture of who was driving at different times of day around different parts of the city. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, that's a little expensive to obtain. It took a lot of researchers, a lot of time. And it's something that you would have to update all the time too. What happens if a new school opens up? What happens if a popular restaurant closes down? So it becomes out of date very quickly. And even though it is a gold standard, isn't something that we can necessarily do at the Portland Police Bureau. And there are other data sources too, such as that may come through our systems that we may have access to. Some of these might be arrest data. Some of these might be demographics of people reporting a particular event or anything like that. Unfortunately, we don't like using those because research has shown they may kind of exacerbate already systemic and institutional bias that may be out there. And for a tool that is trying to better ascertain bias that may exist in policing, we don't want to introduce pre-existing bias because honestly, that would make the results very flawed and very hard to understand. So how we choose our benchmarks. One, we only really want research-supported benchmarks. We want something that has been used at another agency, theorized by academic researchers, something that we've seen published from a civilian oversight group, somebody that says, yes, other people using this has us put a little bit more faith in the measure. Two, we want something that's up to date. The census was last taken in 2020. I probably don't need to remind people here in 2020, there was a pandemic that really changed the social demographics of the city of Portland and the nation as large. People moved very quickly. People changed jobs. People sought different opportunities, different types of work that made those results almost out of date a year later. So we need something that is looking at the time period we're looking at, since we're talking about 2022 today. We need something that really best describes what did the year 2022 look like in the city of Portland. We also need something that is continuously available. We want something that we can use year after year, something that we can pull when we need to, something that we have access to. Because something like an observational study, you can only really do that once every several years because of the cost involved. And therefore, it's not really available as access, and we don't have, and we can't always work with outside teams to get the data when we need. Finally, we want to make sure we use a measure that introduces the least amount of bias as possible. It's impossible. We all know bias is always out there. So we want to do the best we can to make sure whatever we have is introducing the limited amount that we have, so it makes the results cleaner and better to understand. So as I dig into these slides, there's probably going to be lots of questions along the way, and we have plenty of Q&A after this. So just kind of, if you have a question, you might just want to take a note of the title of the slide so that we can always open up the PowerPoint, refer back to it, and we can kind of best describe it and say, oh, that's what this chart, these are what these words mean. So we're digging into the report now. And the first section we always talk about is the number of stops. So in 2022, there were just under 14,000 traffic stops in the city of Portland that were completed by PBB officers. This is the lowest on record. Just as a quick aside, we have been collecting electronic stops data since about 2012. Prior to that, we had a lot of paper forms. So we've been collecting a lot of traffic stops in the past 20 years. 2022 was the fewest amount of traffic stops that our electronic record system has. So very low, right? And it's even declined a little bit since 2021, but it's not uniform across the Bureau. Non-traffic, which is these two divisions I talked about, non-traffic would be patrol officers, investigative officers, support officers, anyone that is assigned to any division except the traffic division, which means the other group is traffic division, just our traffic officers. So non-traffic actually increased the number of stops that they did in 2022 versus 2021. But as you can see on the chart on the left, the bottom blue is just the non-traffic group. They're still making less than they did prior to the pandemic in 2019. Traffic officers only made 3,000 stops last year, which was less than they did in 2021, which is an all-time record low. Mostly that's because the traffic division was essentially reassigned. Most of the officers that did traffic patrol work were reassigned to precinct patrol to help deal with call of service shortages throughout 2021 and 2022. There were some still traffic stops made because they were doing overtime missions and state and federally funded grants that we coded as traffic missions because that's what they were doing. But it was such a small number that it really impacted the number of traffic stops we made in the city of Portland. So as I mentioned, we're going to split these up because traffic and non-traffic do look different because they serve different purposes and serve different areas. So you'll see this table here is a five-year history of the racial and demographics self-reported by traffic officers of the stops they made. All of the charts and tables that you will see during tonight's presentation is available in the written report, so that you can always refer back to it. Nothing has been changed. And our written report was shared as part of the agenda. It's also available on our website at portlandpolice.com. Just click on Open Data and you'll find the stops data tab there. So for the traffic division, the primary mission of the traffic division is to reduce dangerous driving behaviors that frequently lead to deaths or serious injuries. A lot of these are federally funded or state funded projects, such as they'll receive a grant specifically from the state of Oregon to do speeding enforcement or distracted driving enforcement that will kind of gear the type of behaviors that they're looking for on a particular day. They also primarily police on the high crash network. PBOT maintains a map of the high crash networks across Portland. Many of them are the busy roads you'd expect, places like Northeast Sandy Boulevard, Southeast Division Street, Northeast Southeast 122nd Avenue, that stretch in different parts of the city of Portland. Because traffic officers only police, almost exclusively police on this high crash network, they may run into different people that live and work and play in areas that aren't on the high crash network. Because traffic officers are primarily interested in traffic enforcement, we wanted to get a benchmark that really speaks to the type of work that they're doing. Thankfully, Research has a very, very, very good benchmark that we use for that, known as the injury collision benchmark. What that is it's the racial and ethnic demographics of all the people involved in an injury collision in the year of 2022. It doesn't say, are they at fault? Were they the victim? What happened? Were they a driver? Was an injury collision? Was it reported to the Portland Police Bureau? Boom. That's included as the benchmark. It's identified as a best practice and is considered as an unbiased indicator since injury collisions usually require a police response. In the state of Oregon, all injury collisions are supposed to be reported to a law enforcement agency. So we have what we believe is a really complete data set of everyone involved in injury collision in 2022. We also like it because it can also be a general indicator of driving quantity and behavior. The more you drive, the more likely you might be involved in injury collision. If you drive dangerously, you might be more likely to be involved in injury collision. So it can kind of potentially speak to some of the different behaviors traffic officers may be looking out for. So we take that benchmark, and that's our population, and then we have the stop rates, and we compare the two. And it's called a stop disparity index. And essentially what we're saying is and these are made up numbers, but if 50% of the people that were involved in injury collision were identified as white or Caucasian, we would expect about 50% of the people stopped by Police Bureau individuals that year to be also white or Caucasian. So in 2022, there were no disparities observed in the 5 largest groups of drivers. And those are the American Indian, Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white. And those are based on the populations that we saw in the injury collision and also in the stops population. This is a long-standing trend. Traffic has never really come out as having disparate impacts based on who they're stopping compared to the underlying population based on the benchmark. You will notice that the Native Hawaiian is purple, which means that it was identified as being potentially disparate. We throw that out there in interest of transparency, but it's worth noting part of that is just due to sample size. In 2022, I believe traffic officers stopped roughly 25 individuals that they perceived to be Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. And I think there were about 3 or 4 in the injury collision benchmark data set. Anytime you have such small numbers, it makes percentages and statistics and all this fun math and number stuff that I don't always love. It kind of makes it go out of whack. So that's just something to be in mind is we throw that out there, but it's not necessarily that super concerning just because of the low stop rates that's observed there. So we're going to talk about the stop driver demographics for non-traffic. Same chart that you'll see in the written report. And non-traffic officers have a very different mission than we see for traffic officers. The primary mission that non-traffic officers have is reduce and investigate crime in the city of Portland. Sometimes that's responding to an incident of shoplifting. Sometimes it's a robbery. Sometimes it's a 911 call. But patrol officers spend the majority of their day reducing, investigating, interdicting crime in the city of Portland. This has been especially true over the last couple of years as we've seen violent crime reach concerning levels in our community. So they've spent a lot more time focusing on those violent crime behaviors, hoping to reduce that crime rate. Areas of patrol are highly correlated with areas of crime occurrence and the high numbers of calls for service. There may be parts of Portland that have lots of 911 calls because the community is particularly observant and they see lots of violent activity going on. So we're naturally going to have a lot more cars in the area. We're naturally going to have a lot more patrol people out there to help stop the crimes before they occur. Other parts of the city have really low crime rates or relatively low crime rates. Therefore, they have a less, so there might not be as many officers out there on a nightly and daily basis. So therefore, not everyone driving out there may even see a police car each day, where people in other parts of town may see multiple police cars each day. That's just reality of distributing officers and resources where needed the most. And that's not to say that officers don't utilize that they only utilize traffic stops to reduce and investigate crime. No, they also use in the interest of traffic safety missions, if they see a speeder, if they see someone using a cell phone, if they see someone running a red light, patrol officers have just as much freedom, just as enough reason to pull that person over for a dangerous driving behavior as traffic. So the non-traffic driver benchmark this is where we talk about the violent crime victimization benchmark. This benchmark is looking for all the people in 2022 that reported themselves as a victim of a violent crime. Violent crimes are homicides, aggravated assaults, rape and other sexual assault, robberies primarily, that people can become victims of. We use violent crime victimization benchmark because, one, it acts as a proxy by assuming that the victim demographics of violent crime are reasonable estimates of the communities that they live, play, and work. There is, frankly speaking, less research on this benchmark available. This is one that we've only ever seen used by another agency or two, only ever appeared in another research article or two. So it has less research backing than we would frankly like. But we also think it's the best available benchmark that hopefully meets most of the criteria that I laid out 2 or 3 slides ago, where it meets those 5 goals. We are always on the lookout for better benchmarks. We really think it's important to provide a benchmark for the non-traffic officers to really speak to their missions and try to align that the most. But we acknowledge it could have some shortcomings, and we're always trying to move towards a better benchmark, as I like to say. So looking at the Stop Disparity Index, which compares, again, that violent crime population, victim population to the stop rates, and we see that there were no disparities observed. All the bars on the right-hand side are gray, which means that they're roughly in line with the people that are victimized by violent crime. This is a long-standing trend. We have never seen disparities jump out in this area, just because it really matches where officers are patrolling, the type of crimes that they're trying to interdict in those areas. So I'm moving on to a new section where we're talking about why officers are pulling over drivers. Our stops mask, and we added this in 2018 thanks to the new state law that went into effect there, but PBB personnel indicate by ORS, that's Oregon Revised Statute, it's the exact law that says you can't speed, you can't use your cell phone while driving, for the exact reason for stop. So there are 2 broad categories that we look at. Traffic offenses, those would be things like I already mentioned, speeding, running a red light, not signaling while turning, or non-traffic offenses, and those would be traditional crimes such as burglary, assault, shoplifting, robbery. The vast majority of drivers in 2022 were stopped solely for traffic reasons. As you can see, pretty much everyone the traffic division stopped was solely for a traffic reason, and only 4% of the people stopped by non-traffic had some other crime attached. Even though those are small numbers, non-traffic personnel are significantly more likely to stop a driver for non-traffic related offenses than traffic reasons. It's kind of a duh based on the numbers, but it's worth noting this is a long-term pattern that we've seen in that non-traffic personnel have different stop patterns than traffic personnel. So why do traffic divisions stop people? Traffic division personnel perform stops almost exclusively due to the observance of dangerous driving behaviors. Dangerous driving behaviors are the ones identified through traffic officer knowledge, through research literature, that are most likely to contribute to a serious injury or fatal collision. Those would be things like speeding, running red lights, reckless or careless driving, or other things that are severe enough based on Oregon code that they're classified as crimes or Class A violations or Class B violations. Minor moving violations are Class C and Class D violations, where things more fall in line such as illegal parking or things like that that are much more minor and that typically don't contribute to serious injury or fatal collisions. Based on 2022 data, there were no significant statistical differences based on the stop rates, based on the perceived race and ethnicity of the driver among those different moving violations, meaning traffic officers stopped everyone based on their perception of their race and ethnicity for roughly the same type of activity. The chart in the bottom right shows exactly kind of what they stopped people for. Speeding was the #1 offense. About 44% of the stops made in 2022 was because the officer observed speeding. If you notice, all 5 of those are are driving behaviors. Safety belt violations are the one that's like, that's not really a driving behavior, but they receive a lot of grants for that. Of course, we know not wearing a seatbelt is a high contributor to serious injury or death in collisions. So traffic stop reasons for non-traffic look slightly different. You'll immediately look at the chart and go, dangerous moving violations aren't way up there with the 86%. They're actually at 48.3%. Non-traffic personnel are significantly more likely to stop a driver for a non-moving or minor moving violation. Non-moving violations would be things like equipment, like not having the headlights on, usually do not speak to the driving behavior of the driver, but speak to the equipment or functionality of the vehicle. Missing or a license expired plate is a non-moving violation. Drivers perceived to be Black and African American were significantly more likely to be stopped for a minor moving or non-moving violation than other drivers. This is something that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. This is a trend that has been discussed at the highest levels of the police bureau, something that we're always keeping an eye on to see what that looks like and trying to discuss ways to say, what does that look like? Are there changes to be made for that? And that's something that would be great to bring up in the Q&A section as we can talk about the last few things we've done over the past few years to talk about that. In the bottom right-hand corner, kind of emphasizing how non-traffic looks different, you'll see that their number one stop reason, roughly a third of the stops that made by non-traffic officers were for missing or expired license plates. Speeding is still the most popular moving violation out there, but it is way less. It's only 16%, whereas the bottom three are still identified as moving and dangerous driving behaviors. So we're going to move on to searches. This is another decision point, you might say, that exists in the course of a traffic stop. The first decision point that exists is when an officer decides, I'm going to stop that driver. The next decision point is if there is an opportunity to search and to say, is there some additional criteria that says, I think it might be a good idea to search this individual. Consent searches are exactly what they sound like. These are searches where the officer asks consent to search the person or the vehicle of the driver that they stopped. In 2022, less than 1% of all drivers were asked to consent to a search. That's the lowest on record. It has been continuously declining over the past 5 years. The Portland Police Bureau officers are just searching way less in the course of traffic stops than they used to. For 2022, there were no significant differences who was asked to consent or who denied consent. This is significant because it's the first year since 2018 with no significant differences in search requests. And it's the second straight year with no significant differences in denial rate. And what we mean by denial rate is a time that a subject was asked to consent to a search, but they chose not to allow it. For a couple years prior to 2022, we actually saw white individuals perceived to be white were denying searches at twice the rate as Black and African Americans were. That does not exist in 2022. That's great findings. I think that is something that has great power towards improving equitable outcomes in the city of Portland. And there's a lot of reasons that we can talk about later that may have led to that. So completed searches are those times that a search was conducted. 1.3% of all stopped drivers were searched in 2022. This is the lowest search rate on record. As I mentioned, searches have been gradually declining over the last 5 years, so this is no surprise. There were no significant differences of who was searched based on their perceived race or ethnic identity, which is also another positive. Historically, for many years, PBB officers searched Black and African American drivers at a higher rate. This is the second straight year with no disparate differences. As search rates have gone down, we have seen the inequitable outcomes and disparate differences in search rates decline. So in many ways, that's great news. Contraband hit rates are those times that an officer chooses to search and they find contraband. Officers are significantly more successful at finding contraband today than they were 5 years ago. You can just see the numbers there. In 2022, 70% of the times an officer chose to search an individual, they found contraband, compared to 37% in 2018. That's almost doubled in 5 years. Officers are getting more efficient about knowing who to ask about, knowing who to search to find contraband, and what they might find along the way. The number one found contraband year after year is pretty much alcohol. That's no surprise when we're talking about dangerous driving. And of course, DUIs are a significant public safety concern. Drugs is always up there as well with number one or number two. And then number three are firearms. In 2022, 15% of searches, or 28 searches, a firearm was recovered. I just want to emphasize that I'm saying there were 28 searches with a firearm, not that 28 firearms were recovered from a search. Many officers, many times when a search is conducted, officers may recover more than one firearm. So that should not be the final count for the number of firearms recovered, just how often they found a firearm in the course of a search that was illegal. Stop disposition is the outcome of the stop along the way. So this is exactly what happened at the end. After the officer pulled them over, they introduced themselves, they chose to complete a search or not. How did that interaction end? Traffic officers are significantly more likely to issue a citation than non-traffic officers. 83% of their interactions in 2022 ended with the traffic officer giving a citation to the driver. Drivers committing a dangerous driving behavior were significantly more likely to receive a citation than just a warning. Traffic officers, in response to the increasing fatalities on our roadways, were increasingly focused on dangerous driving behaviors and saw that as a way to help curb that trend. There were no significant differences based on the perceived race or ethnicity of the driver. Everyone was just as likely to receive a citation in 2022 when they were stopped by a traffic officer. Non-traffic had a little bit different pattern when we're talking about how they ended stops. Non-traffic officers were more likely to issue no enforcement action, which essentially means, I stopped you. I'm not going to give you a warning. I'm not going to give you a citation. I'm going to send you on your way. A warning or arresting the subject. So again, non-traffic were much more likely to just warn a subject or arrest a subject or release them with no enforcement action. Drivers stopped for a non-moving violation were significantly more likely to be arrested or released with no enforcement action. That is a very interesting finding. Essentially, it says, it highlights the crime interdiction mission of non-traffic personnel, and they're frequently finding people that are involved in these crimes that are worth arresting. They're finding them. But sometimes there are also cases where they may be looking for a particular vehicle. They may be looking for some very vague descriptors of a driving behavior, and it ends up not being the person involved. So in those times, the individual is being released with no enforcement action because it does not match with the crime that they were searching for. Black and African-American drivers and Hispanic or Latino drivers were significantly more likely to be warned instead of cited than their white counterparts. Essentially means if you were stopped by a non-traffic officer and you were perceived to be white or Caucasian, in 2022, you were significantly more likely to receive a citation than a warning in that year. All right, we're going to move on to the focused intervention team stops. 2022 was the launch of this new team, and I believe they launched in, I'm going to get the date wrong, so Lieutenant Dulio can correct me. I believe they launched in February of 2022. So it's not the full year, but it's pretty close. Last year, FIT personnel performed 545 driver and 0 pedestrian stops. That essentially means each day that they were working, they performed 2.2 stops per day. Nearly all the stops were either in north or east precincts. And as Lieutenant Dulio can probably attest, they're very aware of where the highest levels of gun and other violent crime is in the city of Portland. So they tend to focus their patrols in those areas, those very specific areas where that might be occurring. The stop subject demographics do look different for the FIT team versus other members of the Portland Police Bureau. FIT personnel stop a significantly different group of drivers than PBB personnel from other units and divisions. In 2022, they stopped significantly more people perceived to be Black or African American. They stopped significantly less Asian or white individuals that year. And look, it's right there. FIT team was on January 6, 2022. So, haha, I included it. I thought ahead. So the benchmark, we don't have a benchmark for the FIT team. There is no research-supported benchmark for describing the underlying population that may be stopped by units focused on gun violence intervention. Most studies, when we're talking about stops level research, they're meant for benchmarking an entire organization and not small specialized teams. We've scoured the literature. We've reached out to our peers in law enforcement agencies and community oversight groups, and we have never come across another agency that really is hyper-focused on a particular unit that says, how does this compare to the underlying population? The hyper-localized nature of FIT missions makes it difficult to determine who regularly lives, visits, or works in an area. FIT team officers are sometimes just patrolling a 2 or 3 block radius around a particular location. And because of that, the people that may be in that area could have very specific hyper-localized populations. There is really no available data set that really looks at things that narrow. The census every 10 years does smallest levels at the quote-unquote block level. Blocks vary greatly in size across the city of Portland and really not necessarily cover the geographic areas of interest that we're looking for. Plus, we just have to highlight the census only speaks to residential population. It doesn't speak to those involved in entertainment or nightlife, or people may be driving to or from work, or employers in the area. There's no benchmark that we can find that really highlights all these different areas for FIT. That doesn't mean that we're ever going to stop trying. Each year that we publish this report, we always do a new review of research. We always try to review other law enforcement agencies to see if someone's out there. And we're always hopeful that one day we can include a benchmark because it does provide important context and answers a lot of the questions that you guys have. So the overall stop reasons, FIT personnel stop subjects for significantly different reasons than anyone else in the Bureau. There are a larger number of subjects stopped for other crimes, either with or without an accompanying traffic violation. You'll recall that pretty much every person that a traffic officer stopped was only for traffic reasons. And about 4% of the people that non-traffic officers stopped is because there was an underlying crime or probable cause or reasonable suspicion of another crime. The FIT team, about a third of their stops are because of the evidence indicating that there may be another crime involved in this investigation. No significant differences exist based on the perceived race or ethnicity of the subject, meaning that across all the different racial groups, the stop reasons are roughly similar. Stop reasons, FIT personnel are significantly more likely to stop a driver for a minor moving violation and less likely to stop a driver for a dangerous driving behavior. It just highlights the different mission of trying to find the people that might be most involved in gun violence or other crimes in the city of Portland. If you look in the right-hand category, I want to highlight the bottom category there that says non-traffic offenses. The number one non-traffic offense that was stopped by FIT team officers was because they observed that the vehicle was stolen. Almost half of their stops were for stolen vehicles. The remaining 4, assault offenses, weapon offenses, homicide offenses, and even warrants, deal almost exclusively with the people involved in gun violence. Assault would be ag assault or even attempted homicide. Weapon, of course, would be illegal possession of firearms. Homicide offenses would be just like that, homicide offenses. There were no significant differences observed based on the perceived race or ethnicity of the driver. Everyone was stopped for roughly the same reasons, regardless of their perceived race or ethnic group. Consent search request. FIT officers were significantly more likely to request consent to search than other PBB personnel. You'll recall it was roughly 1.3 or something like that, so they're a little bit more than twice as likely to search someone. But practically, that's not a lot of searches. Last year, there were only 6 consent search requests made by FIT officers. With such small groups, we can't really do a robust statistical analysis like we can with other ones, but just comparing Black and African American subjects and white subjects, there were no significant differences in their request rate. You'll notice that only 3 individuals denied the consent search last year, so it's really hard to say. Completed searches. FIT is significantly more likely to search a stopped subject than other members. They're more likely to use consent search as well. You'll see that the search rate is roughly triple that of the Portland Police Bureau as a whole, and that they use consent search about half of the time, which is a little bit higher than non-traffic officers. And again, there are no significant differences who was searched based on their race or ethnicity. Finally, contraband hit rates. These are just what was found during searches by FIT officers. FIT personnel are almost exactly as successful as recovering contraband as other personnel. I believe the overall found contraband rate was something like 69.4, and for FIT personnel it was 69.6, so roughly the equal. Firearms and drugs were tied as the most commonly found contraband by FIT officers in 2022. And stop disposition, FIT personnel are significantly more likely to arrest a subject at the end of the interaction with other Bureau personnel. Again, that highlights that FIT personnel are looking for people involved in different crimes. That leads to more likely be able to arrest those subjects when they interact with them. So that's pretty much a brief overview of the STOPS report, but it's not everything. The STOPS report in 2022 was 78 pages long. That's a lot of pages, a lot of words. It includes other areas of interest not detailed in this presentation, such as stop demographics and breakdowns based on the perceived gender of the stop subject, the perceived age, the perceived mental health status of stop subject. And for the first time ever, we also included many of the measures broken down by precinct so people can really zoom in on what's happening in their area. We also, in the appendix section, have a copy of the survey the officers fill out at the conclusion of every traffic stop to see the different type of fields that can be entered. We also include a benchmarking methodology talking about trying to describe why we chose the benchmarks we did, but also talking about the pitfalls of using census analysis. And also we talk about the data collection and analysis process and history of the Portland Police Bureau. You can find all of our stops reports online. We also produce quarterly reports, which, as the name suggests, summarizes 3 months worth of stops. There really is no analysis test for that. It's just raw numbers of number of stops, breakdown by the racial and ethnic groups of the past 3 months, where we save the meat of analysis for the annual reports. Also want to share a link to the state annual reports. They produce a report each year briefly summarizing the stop activity of all the law enforcement agencies in the state of Oregon. It's due to come out December 1st. We like to highlight their report because they use very different benchmarks than we do, which is great. Like I mentioned, different conclusions can be reached by varying benchmarks. And when multiple benchmarks are saying the same thing, it may lead presidents to say, hey, we can reach a more concrete conclusion as to the presence or not presence of bias in the different police work. Additional questions, we have an email there. It's at pbbopendata@police.portlandoregon.gov. That reaches straight to Strategic Services Division. We also have lots of other open data projects I encourage you to check out on our website. Hopefully we can answer questions and provide service for you there. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to pass it back to the meeting moderator so we can move to the next step. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aubrey. A lot of really good information. We know there's lots of questions. Right now, we're going to go ahead and take our break, and it's a 5-minute break. So let's be back here at 7 o'clock, and we'll open the floor for questions and comments. Thank you. All right. So at this time, we're opening the floor for community and PCCEP questions and answers about the presentation we just received or the data that's been put out. We want to go ahead and make sure you raise your hand so that we can go ahead and call on you and engage in the conversation. If you put a question in the chat, that's fine, but we really encourage folks to answer their question or ask their question out loud. So we encourage you to come off mute and go ahead and queue up to ask your question. All right. Questions, comments?
Frida, can I ask you a quick question?
You may.
Will you be the one kind of calling on people, or would you recommend me or someone else, or how would you recommend that?
Yeah, I will be calling on folks. Thank you for asking. Yeah, I'll go ahead and be calling on folks. And my assumption is that the questions are going to come directly to you. In the event that questions need to be directed towards someone else, I presume you'll be able to go ahead and direct the questions to where they most appropriately fit. Definitely encourage the lieutenant and the assistant chief to chime in where it makes sense for them to chime in as well. Thank you for that. Byron.
Thank you, Frida. Aubrey, I had a question on stops, the question on number of traffic stops. Once PPB is back at full, I guess, per se, how many they'll be at full capacity far as employees and PPB officers, will stop rates go up, or will they still steadily escalate back down with the training and the data reporting that you have?
That's a great question. And I can tell you that in May of this year, many of the traffic officers that were assigned to patrol were reassigned to the traffic division. In the last 5 months, we've already seen more stops by those traffic officers than the last year totally, and maybe even the last 2 years combined for the traffic division. As we move forward and as we hire and more people, I do expect there to be ebbs and flows in traffic stops. Traffic stops are conducted when officer has more proactive time, when they're not responding to calls for service and things like that. So on busier days, it's likely that officers have less time for traffic stops. On less busy days, they may have more time to engage in traffic stop activity. As other missions and units like Lieutenant Dulio and the FIT team and other specialized units across the Bureau, as they use traffic stops as a way to interdict crime, that may influence stops rate as well too. I can't accurately say a crystal ball like over the 5 years what that number of stops will look like, but I do think it's fair to say that the second half of 2023 will look much more like things did in 2020, maybe even 2019. And 2024 will likely be that as well too, just due to the influx of more officers available after training and stuff.
Also, quick, with has out of town people's stops involved in this collected as well? People that are come out of state or visiting, is that there? I heard you touch a little bit on that early in your presentation. But is that also included, or is that also looked at?
Yes, it's included. So our stops measure is any one stop by the Portland Police Bureau. So it doesn't like differentiate if they had an Oregon driver's license, a Washington driver's license, or anything like that. And also the injury collision benchmark also includes people that were involved in collisions of City of Portland, not necessarily people that are from Portland. So certainly there's probably a large chunk of people from Vancouver or Hillsborough or Southern Oregon in there as well too, because they had the misfortune of being involved in injury collision in Portland city limits. Same thing with the crime victimization benchmark. That will include anyone that was a victim of violent crime in the city of Portland, regardless of where they live.
Thank you for that.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. Just a reminder that we're going to ask one question at a time so that if there's other folks in line to ask questions, folks will get an opportunity to ask their question, but be sure to hold on to your question because we will definitely circle back to you. Right now, I see a couple of PCEP members, so I'm going to go to the PCEP members, but Dan and Fern, I definitely see you as well. So, Kip.
There's my mute. So thanks for all of this. So wrapping my head around what I read earlier in the week and the presentation. So if I missed something, let me know. The reporting is an aggregate across, if I understand correctly, precinct by precinct. It doesn't break down the interactions by officer. And I'm wondering if that data is available to understand if, based on types of interactions and the types of outcomes, if there's a way for the PPB to actually recognize whether some officers are more inclined with an inherent bias or a unconscious bias to have a particular outcome versus other officers, and again, how long those officers have been on the force and what kind of training they've had. I feel like all of that would be really critical to understand to make sure that we're having as close to an unbiased interaction as possible.
Good question. The Portland Police Bureau has never really done a comprehensive level officer by officer analysis of their different stops. Practically speaking, to really understand a pattern of bias or not bias, it would require a multitude of stops. We're probably talking about hundreds, maybe even multiple hundreds of stops to better accurately do that. That's something that we also have to be very careful with. The state law as passed in the state of Oregon actually shields pretty much all the officer entries. Anything that we publish cannot reveal the identity of an officer. It was collected under stops data. That's a part of ORS related to stops law. So that is something that we do not have, we have not done. I can say from SSD's point of view, it is not in the plans for the 2023 stops analysis. And if there's ever any direction from that point, it will certainly come from the chief's office or other areas as well too.
Okay, I'll have a follow-up, but I'll hold on to it for now.
Thank you, Kip. Pastor Weisner, did you have a question?
I did, but I'm going to leave it open for the community right now. And I'm going to just hold back for a minute and then have a few words later.
Okay, all right.
For my question.
Appreciate that, Pastor Weisner. Dan.
Good evening. This is Dan Handelman. I use he, him pronouns. I'm with the group Portland Cop Watch, and I've been asking this question back to the Portland Police for several years as I keep making these claims that people driving in from other parts of the state and region make it so that's why the numbers are skewed. But really, couldn't you answer the question about whether that population difference is significant by looking at who gets stopped and finding out where they're from, and then making a scientific study about whether that is actually a factor in this or not? Because I did a video, I'll post the link in the chat later, but that showed that, in order for the percentage of people in Portland who are subjected to force, where the numbers are significantly different, but very similarly disproportionate, in order for the 6% of our population to be represented by 20% of the people who are stopped or have force used on them, you'd have to have 89,000 people who are Black come into Portland on any given day. So is it possible for you to find out who the people who are stopped and whether or not they're from Portland in order to justify that as an explanation? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. And it's actually in line with what some other researchers have done in other benchmarkings, where they look at the place of origin based on the zip code on the driver's license for the individual. That research has been, it's been iffy as most, because we all know that requires the individual that has their driver's license to immediately update their address whenever that happens. And I believe in Oregon and Lieutenant Dulio, Chief Lavelle can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they have 90 days to do so. So 90 days is a long time. And we also know a lot of people don't do it because there's a cost involved and there's equity issues involved in that too. So that is something that we currently do not do. And it would also require an additional data point that the Bureau within its purview, if we view that as important, could probably do that as well too. I do just want to make a quick point of clarification and say people from driving outside the area, we make no claims that that is the cause of why different benchmarks may be different than as they are. It's certainly an observation that driving, people can drive across straight lines, across city jurisdictions. They may be even driving across town, especially as we look at gentrification that's occurred in the city of Portland over the last 20 years. Historically, neighborhoods that historically had large people of color and indigenous groups have migrated across the city willingly or unwillingly, but that doesn't mean that their connections and their roots have left. They may still go to a church across the town because that's where their family went to church. They may still visit their relatives or their loved ones in other parts of the city just because they moved away, which may actually exacerbate the driving differences there. So we're always looking for ways, and if it's something that we find that we start collecting that information, we'll certainly work with our state partners to see what's the best way to do that and moving forward. But your question is rooted in the research literature, which I appreciate, and it's a good question. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Aubrey Fern?
Yes, I'm curious in how you are able to read, understanding what's happening within the Portland area, Portland, particularly in the migration of people, the moving migration of people, and the number of unlicensed vehicles might also portray, maybe those are people that are not Oregonians, but they have moved here. How with this standard statistical model, how do you go about running the numbers and then going back and analyzing? I said that. Let me just say one other thing. I'm very curious to know, within the line of business that y'all are in, I think you said 15 people. How many people of color or underrepresentation models are within your group to help you in the analysis of this data? Because other people's eyes might be different than my eyes and understanding. Can you address that? Because I think that's going to be rooted somewhere in the previous questions. Thank you.
So let me take each question a little bit individually. The first one, which I believe is you're asking, how do we account for people that may be moving to the area and maybe having things like that too? The best way that we account for migration patterns for people moving is the benchmark. It's not a perfect measure. And if people are moving very rapidly, if they are migrating and they're not appearing in the benchmarks, like just for instance, say we had a whole lot of people move from the state of California, and for whatever reason, people from California don't get into traffic collisions, that wouldn't be accounted for in the numbers, and there's no way for us to account for that. So we have to work with a little bit of a degree of uncertainty, and we can only see how the numbers change and how they provide. I will say that just looking at how our injury collision benchmark has changed over the years, it has roughly mirrored the changing patterns of racial and ethnic demographics in the city of Portland. The people of color in the city of Portland that identify as people of color has slightly increased over the last 20 years due to migration patterns and stuff like that. And we've also seen the injury collision benchmark slightly increase over the past 20 years too, which gives us a little bit of belief that it's a reasonable benchmark. To the second part of your question about how many people on our team identify as coming from a background of people of color or indigenous, I cannot speak to that. I definitely don't want to speak to the different backgrounds of people on my team, and that's information that I would probably refer to HR because they're the ones that hold that information. I certainly identify myself as white, and I certainly do not share those backgrounds, but I can say we do work, make sure we talk to community groups, we work with other people, we work with our Bureau Equity team to make sure that we're addressing these decision points and make sure that we're doing the best we can to have that lens on it. I can never absolve myself of some of the different white privilege that comes with myself and how that may have the affect my analysis lens that may exist. But I can say on my personal part, I can tell you that it is there. I try to be aware of it as much as I can, and we try to work with other people as a checks and balance system. So thanks for bringing that up.
We're talking away over here. Barb.
So making me prioritize and only ask one question. The first one is going to be, out of your rough, I can't remember if it was 78 pages. I'm overwhelmed with numbers right now. Out of your quasi lengthy report, you pointed out that there were things that you didn't discuss, such as mental health status. And I'm wondering if you have anything you would like to say or can say about that, given the charge of this group in the settlement agreement. Please. Thanks.
Yeah. So one of the appendix specifically looks at the different mental health statuses. So anytime an officer stops an individual, just kind of like they're asked to perceive the race and ethnicity of the individual, they're asked to perceive the mental health status of the individual that they're stopping. There are three options there, which is 1, they perceive the subject to experiencing a mental health issue. 2, they perceive the subject not to be experiencing a mental health issue. Or 3, they have an unknown perception of the mental health status of the individual. I don't want to spoil anything, but I'll say that section of the report is pretty boring. And the reason why I say it's pretty boring is because I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there are very, very few individuals that the police, during the course of a traffic stop, officers mark as they perceiving the individual as having a mental health status. So we really can't reach any reasonable conclusions about stuff there. That is something that I believe it's one of the last appendixes that might be Appendix H of the report. And there's always a thing if you want to take a look at that, and we're always available to answer follow-up questions about that as well too. So thank you.
Can I follow up and ask where drunk driving type stops fit in with that kind of thing, if you don't mind? Sorry, now I'm breaking the rules.
If I understand you correctly, is if people are drunk, do you think they might be marked as perceived as having a mental health issue or something like that?
Yeah, or once they're found to be drunk, are they no longer perceived to be having a mental health issue? That just trying to kind of make it open-ended.
I am going to refer this question to either Lieutenant Dulio or Chief Lavelle, because they have done more traffic stops I have in my entire life, and I would ask them if they would classify a person that is drunk or under the influence of other drugs as having a mental health issue in the purposes of that question or other mental health reporting we do across the Bureau.
Yeah, I would say for me, if there were clear signs that it was intoxication, then I would not classify that person as having mental health issue. But it's very hard sometimes to kind of diagnose someone's behavior when they're intoxicated, and you really don't know kind of what might be going on behind the scenes too. But I think I would just take what I had in front of me at face value when making that determination.
Thanks, Chief.
Sure.
Pastor Weisner.
I'm gonna go ahead. I see Kate's hands, and she was in our last session, and she had some questions. I'll refer back to her again.
All right. Go ahead, Kate.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. And thank you, Pastor. I apologize. I joined late, so you could just let me know if this was already covered and I'll watch the recording. But does it appear in this report like average, like repeat stops of an individual? So how many on average, or if people are being stopped 2, 3, 4 times, and then if there are racial or other inequities in trends in that data? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Our stops data is actually, in terms of the person being stopped, is anonymized. Officers do not put in the driver's license, the name, date of birth. None of that is on the stops mask itself. So there's no way for me to determine, or anyone else on our team, to determine if individuals are being stopped multiple times.
Pastor Norris, would you like to ask your question now?
Thank you. Yes. This is so confusing. And I see why you started it off in the area very much so the interest is all. And I'm following along in topic. And in these topics is where I kind of want to point to my question. We started with traffic, non-traffic for definition. Then we defined the non-traffic traffic into areas of what benchmarks was looked in each area. So that I can kind of get to the question kind of fast. Where that understanding the benchmark and the category of where that you have non-traffic benchmark for identified with the violent victim, that data and benchmark and information there kind of confuses me. When I go to non-stop fit benchmarks of non-categories of not having data. But if I understood the definition of nonviolence or the violent criminal victim, it falls into the category of benchmarking to be able to identify those numbers that shows a difference. And I'm kind of lost there.
I think you have highlighted a very good distinction that I didn't cover at all, which is why did we use the violent crime victimization benchmark for non-traffic officers, but not for fit? And for us, it comes down to the localization of missions. Patrol officers, we assume, are, regardless if they're assigned to North Precinct, Central Precinct, or East Precinct, are engaged in the same type of police work. So it's meant to be as a broader citywide measure. For the FIT team, they are hyper localized, and they are focused on sometimes block level stuff that is hard to make sure we get the right benchmark for. And we would also be talking about a benchmark that has very, very small numbers, which would also make it difficult to adequately ascertain how accurate that measure is. So I'm not adequately answering your question, and I'm aware of that. And I'll say that, kind of like I said before, the violent crime victimization benchmark is an imperfect measure. We think it has just enough value that covers just enough of our bars for inclusion that we think it is better than having no benchmark. But unfortunately, we don't think it necessarily covers that when we just talk about the FIT team, because we're also talking about the FIT team also has some very specialized missions as well too, and is looking at it's not even just looking at all the people victim of violent crimes. It's actually looking at a subset even of the victims of violent crime. So trying to tear that apart and figure out what the right population is something that we have struggled with theoretically. So it's a very good question, and it's one that I personally struggle with, because I want to have the most perfect and most beautiful report each year, and that things like that make it difficult to do so. yeah, I acknowledge the complexity and the difficultness of answering that question.
Which leads me back to the category of where you've said it imperfect more than once. And that in the areas would point to information such as when you're retrieving the contrabands report in this not so perfect category of victimization, traffic, non-traffic. I'm following, trying to, you're better at it than I am, but you're explaining it and I have to write it down to follow. But the report that you showed where that you used 70% of whites population in that areas of what was retrieved. Is that a homeless population or, and I don't know the proper terms when we look at what the FIT team is focused on in areas of what those retrieving data are, because again, I'm not sure where all of this is setting, because again, I have to go back to the areas of where that you started off in how we categorize the benchmark and look for the information that's close to what we're trying to resolve in disparities.
So I think you're talking about this slide and where we have 70% of a found contraband rate. What this is saying is that out of the white individuals searched, which in 2022, there were 97 across the Portland Police Bureau, 70% of those white individuals were found to have contraband. So conversely, there were 47 people perceived to be Black or African American that were searched. 36 of them were found to have some sort of contraband. So their contraband found rate, their contraband hit rate was 76.6%. So for this analysis, whenever we're comparing, are there significant differences? Are there substantive differences between the groups? We're essentially comparing that 71.1% versus 76.6%. And based on the statistical methodology that we use, that is not a large enough difference to trigger the quote unquote statistical level that mathematicians have spent the last 500 years developing, and to the confoundment of all of us non-math people. So is this the slide that you were talking about?
There was one before, but I'll stay with that and then direct it toward AC Chief. When you're looking at this as what you were trying to get a grasp of, Chief, how do this report help you in the areas of tracking and trying to navigate the officers and the things that you're using this report for?
Yeah, so from my perspective, I look at it kind of from a higher level. We don't break it down to the individual officer level. So I look at it in terms of, you know, how many stops are we making as an organization? As many of you know, in 2021, I asked police bureau members to make and focus on stops that were really more in line with safety issues, you know, excessive speed, running red lights, reckless driving, things of that nature. At the time when the traffic division went away, we still had a whole lot of injury crashes and traffic fatalities. And without the traffic division focusing on that stuff full time, I wanted to make sure officers were spending their time focusing on those stops. And you saw the numbers have gone down since the traffic division has been gone. We're at, you know, record low stops, record low searches. Now that the traffic division came back in this summer, I expect those numbers to kind of go up because you have people out there focusing on it full time. But for me, I really want to make sure that those numbers aren't too skewed. I think we can look at them from precinct level, and that's about the level where you want to see, hey, do you have a precinct that's making a big disparity in stops versus the other two precincts? Why is that? What are the demographics of those precincts? So I think for me and from my perspective, I look at it kind of in those bigger buckets.
I'm going to park because I do have more questions, because here is where I would ask, and I'll leave the next question for those who come. And am I breaking the rule, Ms. Alfreda?
Go ahead, Pastor.
I'm just trying to, I said I would step back and kind of wait till whenever I could speak. So let me park here and let everyone else ask questions, and then I'll write mine so I won't forget it.
All right. Thank you, Pastor Weisner. Dory?
Yeah, so this may be repetitive, and you've definitely spoken to this a few times already, both in the presentation and answering other questions. But I get asked this question all the time about the crime victimization benchmark. And so just wanting to be able to engage with that question better on the staff end. I was wondering if you could speak to, so like why that benchmark for the non-traffic stops? I think we can understand that there's no perfect benchmark, but why that one?
So the main reason we chose that one, or any benchmark, and is because we wanted a benchmark that best speaks to the mission of the work that the officers are doing. So for traffic division, it's so easy for them because they're mainly focused on reducing fatal and serious injury collisions. So it's such a one-to-one match. For patrol officers, their primary goal is to reduce crime in the city of Portland and frankly make the lives of the people that work and visit and live here better. So it matches up and blends very well. To us, that mission connection, that matching of interest is really important to us because it really helps hone in what they're doing, what their goals are, and because of what that is, who they might be contacting in the community. That is what we consider the strength of the crime victimization benchmark, because it really speaks to what they're working on, where they're working towards, and the type of people they may be in contact with, because if there is a crime, they're probably in contact with people that commit crimes, people that are victims of crimes. We would also say that a lot of research has been done about how and why people can become victims of crimes. A lot of times, people are victimized by people that they know. It's the vast majority of the time. They are victimized by their family members, by their acquaintances, by their friends. And they're also tend to be victimized in the places that they most frequent, places like the home, places like the work, places like entertainment establishments. So because people may be victimized in those contexts, we wanted something that talks about that geographical proximity of where they're at as well too. So it's kind of that dual goal of trying to describe where people might be and how it describes the geographic nature of the area, but also how it matches up with the overall mission of the officers and that their primary goal is to reduce crime.
Thanks for that explanation. I'd never heard that link or that sort of connection drawn before.
Kip.
Yeah, I mean that explanation raises more questions for me. I guess my first question is, and again, I'm new to the committee, so apologies. I'm feeling a little vexed in making sure that I'm answering the right questions in the time frame available, with wanting to make sure the community has time to do so also. Is there a can we submit questions to you if we have follow-ups? So I'm not just driving the same thread the entire time and expect a response at some point. I know that can't be open-ended, but it'd be really useful to be able to collect thoughts and ask questions that I have and that we're hearing from the community.
I believe the answer to that is yes. We presented a similar topic to the larger PCCEP group last year. And at the end of that, members of that committee had a list of questions. They emailed it through the Portland Police Bureau, and we were able to answer that as well too. We're here to help answer questions. I will leave that up to the discretion of the group to figure out if that's something that the subcommittee would like to do. But I would say that that is something that we have provided in the past, and that we would probably be willing to do, and able to do again in the future.
Okay, cool. And the one question I did want to ask as a follow-up, and then I'll step off, is I am really curious what benchmarks the Bureau uses to understand on an officer by officer basis of cognitive, conscious or unconscious bias based on the types of interactions they're having, and whether there's data of that in aggregate, it doesn't have to be indirect, available. I find it very curious on, and I respect Chief Lovell's response, but from an HR perspective, I would think we would want to know if the trainings available and the interactions are meeting the goals based on individual officers and not a potential precinct in aggregate.
Yeah, that's a question that I think Chief Lavelle would be very able to answer, the type of bias training that our officers receive through the training division.
Well, not just the training received, which I appreciate there are reports on, but the efficacy.
Yeah, we have an employee information system that does track things like complaints and other information on an officer level, but we don't track necessarily traffic stops per like on an officer level, if that makes sense. And we have officers that work the same district on a regular basis, and that district could have a highly diverse demographic, and we have some that maybe work in an area that's not very diverse at all. And we have other officers that work different shifts. We have officers that work overtime shifts in other precincts even, and officers that rotate districts and work one day over here, one day over here, and one day over there. And it becomes very difficult to really just based on the demographics of stops to say, aha, there's bias here, or to figure that out. And you'd have to have some really, really clear evidence to say, okay, now we need to kind of look at this. And the stops that we do now are so infrequent. I think that might make it even a little bit more challenging.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And just a reminder, we still have public comment later on here. So community members does still have a dedicated space to ask questions as well. So Leslie?
Yeah, I just kind of, from what Kip said, I do want to ask Chief Lavelle about how PPB is using these results, and if it's, if there are any, for example, insights from this report that you can speak to as to how they might inspire some PPB policy changes or amendments.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, one of the changes or amendments is one of the things that we looked at early on was around consent searches. We made some changes. There were some changes to how we were to do consent searches from the state of Oregon. And, we were required to give people a card and record their consent. And there are some instances where we looked and we didn't have that consent recorded. And that forced us to go back and look at how many times this was happening, who was involved. And we were able to identify the officers that did not have the recorded consent and figure out, why that was. And we went back and did some, we called them service improvement opportunities at the precinct level with those officers to make sure they knew the new process and had everything, according to policy. And that also forced us to make sure the way we were inputting it into our system was correct as well. So that's one area where looking at this data from the consent search side was really helpful in identifying some disparities that we needed to correct. But I think, for me, I really look at it kind of more top level And I look at, like, the precincts are probably the easiest high level comparisons to make. Like, how many stops is one precinct making versus the other? What's the disparities in one precinct versus another? And I think in those areas, you could start to see, hey, is there, one precinct that's way out of whack? Is it something that the leadership there is instructing officers to do? Is it something about the demographic of that precinct? And you start to look and kind of dig into it from that perspective. But we don't do it at the officer level, that granular. But I think at the precinct level is a place where we can start to do some of those comparisons and start maybe seeing some disparities that we would maybe want to then investigate further.
Great, thank you.
Dan?
Thank you. So I'm going to make a quick statement and then I'm going to ask my question, because the benchmark about crime victimization is just, it seems irrational to me. All the people who are stopped because they're driving are stopped because they're driving, not because they're crime victims or because people in their neighborhood are crime victims. They're stopped because of something they did when they were driving. So the mission isn't important. And I think the crash data is the only benchmark that makes sense. So I would like to see that comparative chart that you have for the non-traffic officers compared to the crash data instead of the crime victimization rate, because I think you'd find disparities there. That's my statement. My question is, you said that there was no significant difference in the contraband findings by the FIT, but what I think I see is that the black drivers only turned up 57% of the time for the FIT versus 73% for the broader police bureau, versus white people having contraband on them 76% of the time for the FIT and 71% of the time. So there's a huge disparity between 57% and 73%. Can you explain that?
So this one, we're not necessarily looking at a disparity here. And I will say that this is also the victim of a very, very small sample size. Just a very quick math aside here. For any statistical test, pretty much the minimum amount of you can do of a population is 5. 10 is better than 5, but it's still not really enough for a lot of different tests. So in terms of the total number of Black and African American searches is 7 compared to 15 for white. We do say that there are no significant differences. My personal opinion is that is probably due to a lot of the differences in sample size between those two groups. We try to use a standard statistical test each year, year after year. We highlight a little bit of it in the appendix of the stops section. For this particular test, we use something that is known as chi-square methodology, which is just kind of comparing different cells and how they might differ. And in the back end of it, the statistics looks at the population size, which the population size for this would be 7 Black and African American, 15 white individuals, and then it puts them into found contraband, no contraband for each of those groups, and then compares all those individual cells. That is a very boring explanation for what this test is doing. But because the sample sizes are so small, it did not determine any statistical difference. If the sample sizes were bigger and there was those percentages stayed the same, it would certainly come up as a significant difference between the two. And I will say that there, in the research literature, one of the different things that can be coming out is if a group has high search rates but low contraband rates, researchers in the field have said those are potential disparities that we should look at. It's been very rare in recent years that we've seen significant differences in the number of white individuals, in the hit rates of individuals and the hit rates of Black and African individuals. And it certainly would require a lot more searches to say that with more definitive accuracy.
All right, Pastor Wiseman.
And that's a great place for me to come back to Chuck with. You notice I use Chuck, right? So as you say, the traffic rates have decreased, they're lower on traffic, but yet with the non-traffic patrol, it's increased. So there is how I'm trying to wrap my head around the difference there, such as if you got I'm getting confused because I'm trying to keep myself into a place where I'm speaking on subjects and category and the benchmarks there. So the thought, again, it was lower with traffic, but yet it's higher in non-traffic. Could you explain a little more of that, if that question makes sense?
Yeah, and
I was
before-
asking Chief, I'm sorry.
Oh, and I'll say, and I'll help with Chief Lavelle a little bit of context here. It went up by a few hundred, and I do know that, and Lieutenant Dulio can talk about this too, the different missions and purposes they use. But we do know some of the increase can be attributed to Lieutenant Dulio and the FIT coming online in 2022 and using traffic stops, and then also missions that are done in various precincts to combat stolen vehicle, violent crime. They use stops as a thing like that as well too. So I'll pass it over to Chief to more accurately answer that question.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on, Aubrey. When we did disband the traffic division, they went back to precincts. So there were, less people focusing full time on traffic stops, but in the time that they were gone, we did really focus on a lot of missions. We did a lot of stolen vehicle missions, a lot of organized retail crime missions, and missions to address particular problems in areas that I think probably were what tipped the scales that little bit. Because now you have people focused on this crime category, trying to make stops, make arrests, and things of that nature. And you don't have this other group that's full time focusing on the traffic piece,
which is the crash and population. I get this, so I'm hoping everybody else is following along. Thank you, Rance.
Barb?
Hi, so a couple things here. I'm wondering if with the FIT team, when the numbers are low, I'm wondering if time is the solution for that. And like, if as the FIT team is online longer, are you going to be able to analyze those things more easily?
Yeah, that's a great question. If we combined multiple years of analysis, yes, we might be able to get a larger sample size to get a better determination of something like that. That is not something that we have done before. But that's not to say we can't do it again in the future. We would have to think of other theoretical considerations, such as making sure, for instance, 2022 has the same rough context and cultural relevancy that it might with 2024, 2025. But theoretically, yeah, if we rolled multiple years together, we might be able to do analysis that would give a little bit more evidence, so we can look to see what those numbers pop out. So yeah, you're dead on. You're actually correct.
I'll save the rest of mine for public comment.
Thank you, Barb. Dr. Rochelle, and this will be the last comment before we move to public comment.
Yes, I'm a little confused about the data that you keep. I think you said that the stops data were pretty much anonymous, so you don't have date of birth and et cetera. And since the primary mission of the traffic division and maybe other police is the safety of the community, I'm not sure why you don't keep data on date of birth or other things that, for example, insurance companies keep data on age, gender, time of day, other things that may cause a person to drive differently than some other person.
Mm-hmm. So I want to have a little bit of a distinction here and say that the stops data that we collect, which is what we're talking about, is a survey, is stored in a different place than stuff like that. We do, as a Portland Police Bureau, we do have a complete electronic database of all the e-citations written by traffic officers. Those are the information that goes to the court and certainly includes the defendant's name, date of birth, the offense that they were pulled over, the vehicle that they were driving, time of day, day of week, and stuff like that too. If we wanted to do an analysis on the different factors that may be due, we would use that database and not the stops database, just because it's important to wall off due to the state law about making sure we're not using subject demographic factors and specifically, I'm sorry, subject identification factors in the analysis of stops data, because that's actually in the ORS that we are not supposed to collect or reveal any data that may inadvertently disclose the identity of the officer or the subject making the stop.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aubrey. All right, Pastor Weisner, 10 seconds.
Thank you. It's less than 10 seconds. I'm going to ask, there was questions that were submitted to us out of the last comment or the last town hall we had around this information. If it's okay to have those questions submitted, I heard him earlier say that he would take questions and be able to get back and answer that. So if that would be okay, we can send those questions over. And those who had submitted those questions, I wanted you to know that only reason I didn't go through them tonight is because I wanted to get more of this information and the current questions of information we can. Would that be okay, Dory?
Yeah, of course. I think there is appetite among PCCEP members to follow up with more questions in writing. So we will work to consolidate those and then send them along, is what I'm hearing.
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Alfreda, for 15 seconds.
You're welcome, Pastor Weisner. Now we're moving to public comment. I know, Barb, you said you had a public comment you'd like to make.
And this time can also be used if people had additional questions and wanted to use this time to engage with our presenters, feel free. And you can also speak about anything unrelated to the content of the meeting.
Thanks, Dory. Go ahead, Barb.
Thanks. I want to speak to sort of the general topic of transparency, accountability, and community engagement, and where I see a role for PCCEP, and I'm sort of asking for PCCEP to hear me and consider that. And with regard to this particular topic specifically, I would really like to ask that PCCEP consider having the topic engaged in more than once a year, because it seems like there's, ebbs and flows of people that have interest in PCCEP and they don't necessarily spend a year being involved. And so then there's sort of loss of knowledge. But along with that, there can also be some, I want to say categorizing, and that's not really the right word that I want. So for example, if in 6 months, a subcommittee of PCCEP was going to host something similar to this as part of the agenda or website inviting people, it might refer back to this actual meeting to say, hey, to be prepared for next year's stops data, you might want to look at this. And I'm not getting the timing right exactly, but I'm trying to make that point that if it was sort of like an every six month kind of thing, bopping between the main PCCEP meeting and a subcommittee of interest, and then also making the questions that are being asked and then answered available to the public in a way, not just kept to PCEP members, I think that that would be great. Likewise, on a similar topic of making PCEP and thus Portland Police more accessible to the public, I have multiple ways of getting a hold of the COCL report that's going to be talked about at an upcoming PCEP subcommittee meeting. But I would make the assumption that the easiest way would be to go to the website and go to the page with the agenda on it for the meeting and be able to find the draft COCL report that's being discussed. And I couldn't do that. And I don't think that it's set up that way. I think that having the Portland COCL page is great once I found it by going back to the email. I don't want to get like bogged down in the weeds, but it shouldn't be that difficult. It should be much easier. And I know the website's a pain. So I'm trying to think of ways that things can be categorized easily. I'm not trying to ask staff to do a lot of work, but to make it more accessible to the community to, come in and catch up with links to YouTube things or links to the documents being more accessible. Just a community ask. I appreciate everybody's hard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. Chief Lovell.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank Aubrey and Lauren and the team for putting together this presentation and coming to present tonight. This is very intricate stuff, and I'm not a data scientist, and it's can be difficult to understand and break down. I just wanted to say thanks. Thanks for answering tough questions, and we really appreciate the work you put into it.
Yeah, we echo that as well, Chief. Thank you. Leslie?
Yeah, just had a question about the consent search data. So I know that there showed no disparities in who refused consent to a search. Do we have any metrics around how many were still searched after they refused to search, and do we have that broken down by race and ethnicity by any chance? I tried to do a quick search on the report and couldn't find anything.
Yeah, you've actually highlighted an area of the report that we have never calculated. So yes, it's actually two separate questions. One of them is consent search requested but denied, and then the follow-up is, did you conduct these searches? So yes, that data is available and out there. We have not personally looked at that data to know how many of them denied the search and that were searched. Of course, they would be searched using either a warrant or a warrant exception in those cases. But that's something that we have the data for, but we've never analyzed. It's an interesting topic, certainly.
Thanks for that. I was curious.
All right. Well, it's 7:59 and I don't see any hands. And I think by the time we finish saying these last few comments, it'll be 8 o'clock. So we're just gonna move to go ahead and wrap the meeting unless there's any. I don't think there's any final comments. I don't see any hands.
There is. I'm sorry.
I knew.
As the chief acknowledged those on that team for being here, we do appreciate, and I do believe this is the first time that AC Chief has met with a group, and we thank him for making that appearance here at the PCEP level in his new role. And as what was said before, Chief, is your many years of service has been truly recognized from many people as you know, that I would speak for, as well as what I have been involved with in the many of years. So we thank you in the part of the work that you have done in the roughest part of the time of the city that had to face what it had to face. And then also to Natasha, I see her in the room. We thank you, Natasha. It's been a while since we saw you, but it's good to know that I can find you in the great company in the community engagement room. And then also Lieutenant Kenneth Dulio of the FIT team. I believe, I'm not sure, but this may be his first time here. But we look forward to seeing you more, and we really appreciate you for the work that you're doing and strong work that your team and all of those that are up under your leadership, crisis response, and others. But thank you all for making time and being here. Of course, I will say that to the broad as well.
Yes, I echo all of that, and thank you, Strategic Services team and Aubrey, for your presentation. Much appreciated. And PCCEP, you know, as you've already been discussing this topic, and I think you know, you will continue to. You know, this meeting is certainly just a springboard to move forward and continue engaging with these folks and this information. So we really appreciate your time tonight. So just a quick wrap up. So there is no meeting next week, and then our meeting the following week, the first week of November, will be a COCL town hall. That's all we got. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you especially to our wonderful facilitator, members of the public for your contributions, and our accessibility support for your contributions. And with that, it is 8:02 p.m. and this meeting is adjourned.